Welcome to the Friday edition of Juan's World, and my title, The Medium is the Message, comes from Marshall McLuhan, who was a Canadian philosopher who became kind of a cornerstone of media studies back in the 50s and 60s, and that was one of his prime terms, and that's what I want to talk about today. I did a blog post on him a couple of days ago because it was his birthday, and I analyzed that concept of the medium is the message for both its strengths and weaknesses, and I want to do that here too, and this is kind of isomorphic with that concept. That is, the blog is one medium over the internet, and the video, which is also going to go on the internet of course, but the video is on YouTube. It's a different kind of channel, and the blog is written with some photographs, and this is all video, auditory and visual, and the content, that is the message, isn't going to be very different, but the medium is. And the question I'm posing is the medium really the message? Well, let's get started on that. Now, one of the things that McLuhan opens with is the idea of the invention of the light bulb. And he says that when the electric light bulb, when the electric light bulb became common, people's lives changed because they could now work, read and do all sorts of things when it got dark, whereas before, with gas lights, with an earlier candles and kerosene lanterns, it was a lot harder to do that, a lot harder to do a lot of things. So life became very different. In the days when people had candles only, and they were very expensive, then when it got dark, people either sat around the fire and talked and drank and ate or whatever, and then went to bed. And when it got light, they got up. And so their lives were very much determined by the sun. Not completely. Some people had to get up in the dark because they had to go out and milk the cows or something like that, or get ready for work, even go to work in the dark. But their lives were completely changed when they could just switch on a light, and it wasn't quite day, obviously. The electric light doesn't provide quite as much illumination, but certainly enough to be able to sit and read a book, do some household tasks, spinning, knitting, weaving, all manner of things that were not possible. And what he says, and this is one of the catches, he said, the light bulb is a medium with no message, but it's a medium that changes people's lives. And he goes on to extrapolate from that by saying that all media change lives, regardless of the message. And one of the things that made me think of was the invention of television. And I'm in a, I don't know whether you call it fortunate or unfortunate situation. I was born in 1951, And when my family moved from Argentina to England, there was television available in England, but we didn't have one. They were expensive, and there wasn't a lot of programming, mostly during the day. I'm not sure, but I think there were 1 or 2 channels only. My grandparents had a television, and I remember watching them once or twice at Christmas when I was over at their house, and I saw a cartoon or something like that, and it was in black and white, so it was kind of interesting, but it wasn't a part of my life. Then in 1958 we moved to South Australia, and at that time there was no television in South Australia. There may have been on the East Coast, but there was no television in South Australia. It wasn't until I think around 1960, I'd have to check, but somewhere around there, television came to South Australia. And up until that point, the medium of choice for visuals were movies. So my family went to the local cinema. It was called the Hoyt's Ozone Cinema in Gawler, South Australia. And usually on a slow night, maybe a Tuesday or a Wednesday, we would go. And they had a different feature film each week, so there wasn't much point in going on more than one night, unless you want to see the same film again. And it was a whole evening's entertainment. You bought a ticket, and for that you got a cartoon, a newsreel, sometimes a B film, and then the main film. So that was the whole evening taken up. And I'm particularly interested in the newsreel, and I'm thinking about the Olympics, because in 1960, before we had a television, I went to the movies with my parents on one evening, and the newsreel contained clips of various events at the 1960 Rome Olympics. Now this newsreel only lasted maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and it contained all the world news. We knew the news from newspapers and from the radio, so we knew the essence. We knew who'd won certain races, we knew about political events and wars and so forth from those media, but we got to see them visually on the newsreel. But for the Olympics, maybe it lasted 2 or 3 minutes, and what you would see is like the end of a race. Like you might possibly see the whole of 100 meters, because that's about 10 seconds. But for most races, like the 10K or something like that, you just see maybe the start, couple of bits in the middle, and the end. You couldn't see the whole thing. Or you'd see the winning point of a swimming race, or a high jump, a very spectacular high jump or long jump or something like that. And that was it. That was all we saw. Well, then television came, and television changed our lives completely. We had a typical living room, square, with furniture in it for sitting around and drinking coffee and whatnot. And before television, all the chairs were organized in a circle, because we would sit in a circle and talk to each other. Or when people came over, all sit down, and and it was all inward facing. And as soon as we got a television, we had to figure out 2 things: where the television was going to go, and how the seating was going to be arranged. And the television turned out it was convenient to have it in one corner, and the seating was all arranged in a row, or sort of semicircular row, facing the television, so that the structure of our living space was completely altered. And it remained that way for the rest of of my childhood. We moved houses, moved continents, and always the television was in one corner of the room, and the seating was all arranged, not quite so formally perhaps, but where everyone sitting in that room could see the television. They could see each other, of course, too, but the focus was the television, and the television was always on. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing. It was always on, and it formed a auditory and visual background to the living space. Well, now, that McLuhan would say, well, that's the same as the light bulb, that it's not so much the message that's being delivered as the medium. The medium has changed your living space. Well, when it came to the Olympics, the message was important. And the 1964 Olympics in Tokyo were really life-changing for me. I was not especially interested in the Olympics up until that point, but the Tokyo Olympics had been Japan's opportunity to show that it was a shiny, bright, post-war, non-belligerent, technologically sophisticated country. Before that, Japanese goods had been considered to be rubbish, plastic toys and imitations of better quality goods elsewhere. So the word Japanese meant poor quality. And the Olympics was their opportunity to show off their new technology, and it was amazing. For example, I remember watching in the first week the swimming contests, which don't particularly interest me, although there are a couple of Australians in the races. One, Dawn Fraser, who was a famous short distance swimmer, and Ron Clark, and they both got medals. Dawn Fraser got her third gold medal. So we kind of watched that. But what appealed to me was that for the swimming, they were started by an electronic buzzer, and they all got off their blocks. And all the timing was electronic. That is the sound that started the race also started the timer. The timer was on a crawl on the bottom of the screen, and I was just mesmerized. It was just amazing to me, and it changed my feeling about technology in general. And of course, this was the era of the space race as well, so we got to also witness all of that NASA stuff, and the Russians. We had heard about Sputnik back in the 50s, but only ever seen newspaper images. But now we was watching rocket launches and even images of the astronauts in space. It was just transformative. But the message was there. It did make a difference. Marshall McLuhan basically said that it didn't matter whether you were watching like a war movie or a children's story. It was the medium that was giving the message. Well, I disagree. It does make a difference whether you're watching a cartoon or a bloody battle. It does make a difference whether you're watching the news or a movie. But it does change your life. That's without doubt true. Well, now Marshall McLuhan's notion about the medium being the message was really pretty vital in the 60s. And then in the 70s, there was a lot of pushback. A lot of people saying the kinds of things that I'm saying, that he's not taking into account the things like the kind of channel, the fact that there are different messages that can be conveyed. And as one of my peers in graduate school said, it doesn't matter whether you read Shakespeare's Hamlet in a book, see it on stage, or watch it on a movie. A lot's going to be different. That's true. That you can't show all of the action of Hamlet in a book. You have to just read the minimal stage directions and imagine them. You can see them on stage. In a movie, the effects are going to be very, very different. You're going to have a real castle in, perhaps in Elsinore. You're going to have outdoor scenes as well as indoor scenes, and they are all going to be visible on the big screen, not on the stage. So there are going to be differences, but deep down, as my friend said, he's still the to be or not to be guy. That speech is going to be in all of the media, and yes, it's different in some ways in the different media, but under it all is the same message. So that he's sort of right and sort of not right. Well, he kind of languished for most of the 70s, and then starting up towards the end of the 80s, he got a boost from the introduction of the internet and the World Wide Web. And we do see a difference. If you've lived as long as I have, I'm 70 years old, I've gone from no television to television, to computer graphics, to personal computers, to the internet, to the World Wide Web, and so forth. From writing letters to people and posting them in a letterbox and getting a reply back. When I lived in the United States, I kept up a long correspondence with an old college friend of mine who was in Kenya, and it would take about roughly maybe 2 weeks for a letter to go to him and me to get a reply, so that we communicated about twice a month. Once we had email, we could write to each other every day. And the one thing that I noticed immediately is how the medium does alter the perspective, in as much as his writing was very characteristic. When I saw an envelope in my mailbox with a certain writing on the envelope, never mind the stamp, but just the writing I knew it was from him, because his writing was quite distinctive. I opened it up, and this was clearly an artifact from him, which I could also hold in my hand, and that he had held it in his hand. Much the same as my stamp collecting. I've always loved to collect historic envelopes, including ones that were sent on certain voyages or airmails, knowing that actual artifact was in the hands of certain people at certain times and is now in my hand. As soon as I got emails from John, my friend, they were in, I don't know, Times New Roman or Calibri or whatever. It was not his handwriting. It was still his voice, still his tone, still his same way of writing, but that handwriting was gone. And I miss that. I don't miss the twice a month business, but there was something much more deliberative about handwriting a letter than writing an email. But in the grand scheme of things, this is also interesting, in the grand scheme of things, email did not change the volume of my correspondence very much at all. I still write many more letters, now emails, to people than I get back. I think the ratio is better than 10 to 1, but closer to 8 to 1 maybe. That is, I send out about 8 emails and I get about one reply. And in the days of handwriting, it was about the same. Because people don't like to write. It's a sad fact that they don't, and I do. And I actually prefer the internet because I can write emails a lot quicker than I can handwrite. My typing is a great deal faster than my handwriting, and if I write fast, people can't read my writing, so I have to write quite slowly, whereas with typing it's done. But I don't get a lot back. And my son reminded me at one point that there was an alarm bell sounded in the days when the telegraph was invented, and people were writing to newspapers and saying that, the telegrams are going to put letter writing out of business. New medium, faster. I can, flash off a telegram and it'll get there within minutes, whereas it takes days, sometimes even weeks, for a letter to get there. And everyone's going to start using telegrams instead of letters. Well, it didn't happen. What about reading a book on Kindle or on your laptop as opposed to a book in your hand? Interesting too. Or like when I got my first PC, an awful lot of my colleagues did not want to compose on a word processor, on a computer. They would do what they'd always done, and what I had done too, which is to compose a paper or a book on a notepad with a pen or pencil, and then when everything was ready to be typed up, go to the typewriter and type it up. So instead they would go to the computer and type it up, and were always upset because the screen did not show them a whole page. They were fixated on this idea of a whole page, which would be the same with Kindle versus a physical book. They, like turning pages in a book as opposed to using a mouse or a scroll pad, whatever, that they could not adjust to the new medium because there was still some message underlying there that they couldn't transform to. Well, I was perfectly happy with it. I used to use an old word processor called WordStar, which I think held about maybe 10 lines of script on the screen, and you had to keep scrolling down, and then there would be a end of a page, and then you start a new page, and so forth. And I know a lot of people, in fact one of my colleagues still does this. We're talking about 30 years later. She types everything up on her computer, prints it out, and then takes a red pen to the copy and does her copy edit on the physical paper, and then goes back to the computer and edits the copy. Well, apart from the fact that I don't have a printer at this point, I don't do that. I do all of my editing on the screen, and it's just fine. And most people, like my son, who doesn't know an era without the World Wide Web, he was born a little bit before it became particularly prevalent, but by the time he was able to use a computer, his computer that I gave him to work on for school and stuff was hooked up to the internet, and he's always used it as part of his life, and he reads all of his books on Kindle. He's not concerned about having a physical book in his hand. And because I travel so much now and move houses quite often every few years, I don't want a ton of books. I'm quite happy to have Kindle and storage of books and my own manuscripts in a cloud. It's very convenient. But it is a different medium, and it does make me wonder to what degree my writing is different now because I am using a different medium, I don't fully know. In fact, I have never published a book fully online before, but I'm doing it now. I've got 2 books that are under contract. One of them will be published online, open source, and that's it. It'll be copy edited by a copy editor using online resources. I'll look it over and reply and so forth. Everything will be done online. The other book will be print, but everything up to the production of the book will be done online. The copy edit, making the index, and so forth. And a lot of it's going to be a lot easier. Making an index with a paper copy is a complete pain in the neck. But using modern word processors, I can just highlight the words that I want to index throughout the manuscript. Just an author's name or a key word or whatever, and then just click index, and it'll just spit the index out. Same with a table of contents. And as I change the book, and like the page numbering changes, the table of contents and the index automatically change. I don't have to go back and rethink the organization that way. I mean, it's marvelous. I'm quite happy with it. But there are some people who cannot change. They cannot change the medium. And it's fascinating to me in the sense, if we go back to McLuhan, that the message is not exactly the same, but it's pretty close. But the medium has changed. And in one sense, there are important changes. That is, that the audience of my writing will change. Now, a lot of people who still won't read anything, but that's because a lot of people just don't like to read. But there will be a number of people who will have access to my book on Genesis, which will be open source, because it'll be free. And all they've got to do is click on it and go to it and read it. And, like most of the scholars that would read it as a printed book will read it online also. But there's going to be other people who will access it, at least. I don't know if they'll be particularly interested in the entire content. But it will lead some people to it that would not have gone to a library to borrow it or bought it in a bookstore, because it's too much effort to go and find a bookstore and maybe order it, because it's an academic book, so it's not going to be in your local Barnes and Noble. But if it's online and all they've got to do is point and click, then it's accessible. And McLuhan's ideas have become more foundational to what we call new media, the online stuff. But I think the strengths and weaknesses of his idea are about the same. That is, his ideas are simplistic. That there is a difference between what happens in a culture when the light bulb is invented versus when the television is invented, because the light bulb does not have content and television does, and content makes a difference. So it's not simply that the medium all on its own is the message. The medium is transformative and contains messages of its own, but the medium also transmits messages of different qualities or of differing qualities. And the underlying, the deep down message is the same, regardless of the medium. Sorry, Marshall. So that's the medium is the message. It was one of those catchphrases that appealed to us in the 1960s and has lost its luster since then. I am, however, very encouraged by new media. And one thing I wanted to mention before I close, that channels like YouTube have opened up possibilities that we never had before. I can post these videos on YouTube and they're there for everyone to see for all time. And it fascinates me, the technology that people use for their YouTube videos to appeal to a wider audience. And many of them, even though they're done by people who are kind of like me, but who have some professionals working with them, and so they have nice graphics, you know, like my graphics are not very good. My set design is not very good. It's me sitting on a couch. I could do better. I could have a background, I guess, and I could have some dancing figures and, you know, point up here to a link, and, you know, but I'm not interested in that kind of stuff. But one of the things that has interested me for a long time is how so many of these, I'm not going to call them amateurs, but they're not like cable stations or mainstream television like NBC, CBS, CNN, and so forth. That a tremendous number of these people use gigantic microphones, and they usually have the microphone like here, so you can't really see their face because the microphone, and it's huge. And it usually has a gantry. And then this big and black, and this has a hood and all the rest of it, and you can't really see the person. And I just don't understand why they do that. I mean, I understand it in radio stations, because they want the highest quality audio that they possibly can. But if you see live television, let's say the comedians in the evening, Jimmy Kimmel, Steve Colbert, Jimmy Fallon, those kinds of people, they all have a microphone like mine. I'll touch it so that you can see where it is. I can't hear what this is doing, but it's probably making a noise. It's what's called a lavalier mic, and I've got it clipped onto my collar. And you probably can't even see it. Stephen Colbert has one that is like a tie clip. He wears a tie, a suit and tie, and he has a tie clip with his lavalier mic on it. And that's all they need. You know, like way back, Johnny Carson had a fairly big microphone, but it was sitting on his desk. It didn't obscure his face, and I think it was sufficiently omnidirectional that his guests could use it as well. Letterman used to use a mic on the desk as well, but apart from that, all the modern ones all use small lavalier mics, and their guests have their own lavalier mics. They have little transmitters. You can't see them. They're in their pockets or attached to their back somehow or other. They're portable. Mine isn't portable. Mine is plugged directly into the camera, but you can't really see. It's not obtrusive. Why do these podcasters or vloggers or whatever, why do they insist on having these gigantic microphones that obscure their faces? Why don't they, at minimum, have them far enough away from their faces so that they don't get in the way? There's a clear case where they're giving a message via the medium. They're saying, I am so important and my words are so vital, so precious, that I'm willing to obscure my face with this gigantic microphone to show how much they matter. It's just really bizarre. I might even call it narcissistic. Whereas I'm quite happy with my tiny little lavalier, which picks up the sound perfectly well, I hope. I mean, certainly when I do my editing, it sounds fine. There is a case where the medium is giving a message that I don't like. So my other message is, of course, please tell your friends about my videos. Please like, please subscribe, and come back on Tuesday when I have a special Basque dish, which I'm actually preparing as I'm also making this video, but you won't see it until Tuesday. And meanwhile, have a good weekend.